Let's start with the first exercise, starting the effect and then alternating between highlight and shrink on this first div here. I already got the start effect method here, so here I need to use setInterval to, well, switch between these two classes. In order to attach the classes, I also need some property in the data property here, to which I can bind the class attribute. I'll name it effect classes, and this is just one possible setup here where I use an object which I want to attach. You could also simply store true or false here, so yeah, effect classes might be just true or false, and then set up this object up here in your HTML code. Both will work as you learned in the last lectures. So here in this object, I basically want to have my highlight class, and this shall either be attached or not. So initially I, let's say, will not attach it, and the shrink class, which initially should be attached, for example. Up here on my div, I can now bind to this class property by using vbind and then class. And here I will refer to effect classes, so to this property I just created. If I now hit Control Enter, well, we see it is filled gray, but hasn't really shrunken. And to force it to shrink, let's add important here after the width. Just like that. If that is missing in your code you copied. It should be there though. So now you see it shrunk. Now to make it alternate upon setInterval when hitting the start effect button, I will set up setInterval here. And I want to alternate every second, so I'll set this to 1000, and then this is the function I'll execute every 1 second. Now in this function here, I will need access to my Vue instance, therefore I need to bind it to a new variable. So this is bound to VM to get access to my properties on VM here. I can then set VM, and then here effect classes highlight equal to the opposite, and I'll say this right away. There will be other ways of controlling this, of course. Feel free to come up with any other way. I'm going to choose a very explicit one here. And of course, I want to do the same for my shrink class here. So let's copy that too. If I now hit Control Enter and click Start Effect, we see that every second this jumps around, so it changes the style, because this is what I set it up to. I'm alternating between these two classes. I'm reversing the value of true or false here in the effect classes property every 1 second, thus changing the style applied to this class. Time for exercise number 2. Create a couple of CSS classes and attach them via the array syntax to this unstyled div here. Well, let's quickly do this. I'll add here a class, let's say blue, and I wanna set the background color to blue here. Next, I will set this to float. I will create a new class float where I set up float right. And lastly, I will set up text color with a dash, where I will simply set color to yellow, let's say. With that set up, I can now go to this div, use vbind again to bind to my class, and now I want to use an array to attach all these different CSS classes here. Now in order to do that, I first need to create some properties holding links or holding the names of these classes. Of course, to be straight, this of course is a much longer and complicated way than just using normal class attribute and saying float, text color, and so on. But the sense of this exercise, of course, is to understand how to use this array syntax. So here in my data property, I will then create float and set this equal to float as a string referring to this class. And then I can use float in here. I also don't have to create a property for each CSS class here. I can also enclose them in single quotes, blue and text color, because that is what float here will also resolve to in the end, a single quoted CSS name. So if I now hit Control Enter, we see it floats on the right, it is yellow, and it has a blue background. It doesn't look particularly pretty, but our styles are applied successfully using this array syntax, thus allowing us to flexibly add multiple classes. In lecture number 3, we want to let the user enter a class and attach it. Well, we already get a couple of classes which we can attach to this div here. So in order to see it though, I will add a new one, which I will set to visible. And this shall simply be where add a width of 100 pixel and a height of 50 pixels so that we can always see this div. I can then use vbind here to bind to my class. And now to show yet another way of adding this, I will use the inline syntax, writing it here in the HTML code. I could outsource this in a separate property in the data property as well, like we did here for effect classes. And here I will always attach visible, the class I just created, so that we can see the div. And then I want to let the user attach another class. The user attach class will be stored in a property here. I'll name it user class. Initially it's empty. And I can bind to this property using two-way binding with vModel here. This will make sure that whatever the user inputs gets bound to this user class property here. And now I want to use this user class property here in my setup in this div. So right now I'm attaching visible true. And now I can mix this, or I can use the array syntax and mix this class here, which is always attached. So I could have, of course, also just written string visible, but I just, again, want to show the different possibilities because maybe we had some code which conditionally changes true or false here. But now I want to also bind my user class here. And this will just be a string which represents a class name. Keep this in mind. So if I now hit Control Enter, we kind of see the div here, but we really only see it once I enter blue here. We can also now enter float to also float it. So this is also possible. We can kind of chain our classes here, separated with a white space, of course, so that it really is different classes. And yeah, this is how we can reactively or flexibly set a class. Doesn't have to be changed by user input. This is just the easiest source to simulate there. Could be any source changing user class here though. And mixing it with the array syntax with this other way of adding a class with key value pairs where the key says the class name or gives you the class name and the value indicates whether this class should be attached or not, stored as an object directly inline in the HTML code there. In exercise number 4, I want to pick up on that. But now the user shall not only enter his own class, but also be able to switch this visible switch, let's say. So here I want to bind to a new property, which I haven't created yet, which I'll name is visible. And I'll set this to true initially. I can therefore here in the first input still bind to, let's say, user class. On the second input here, I then want to bind to is visible to let the user change this between true or false. On this div here, I now bind to class as above, and I will simply copy the code from there. But the key change here is that for visible, for this object, I just said the value here determines whether this visible class will be attached or not. Now the user is able to set this, so I will bind this to isVisible, referring to this property, which is bound to this input here. With that in place, let's hit Control Enter. You see true is populated and we clearly see something there. If I remove it, it seems to get removed as this input then moves up. So let's change this back to true and let's name it blue. There it is. Again, if I remove true here, it's gone. If I set it to anything else, which is interpreted as true, we see it again. If I explicitly set it to false, we also see it. The reason being that whatever we enter here always is a string. And strings are interpreted as true, not cast to booleans automatically. So this is why only an empty input field will remove it, whilst false won't. Because again, it is treated as a string, not as a boolean. And strings are therefore then always treated as true. So that's just a little issue you might have with understanding this otherwise. So that's important to understand how JavaScript, that's not VueJS, how JavaScript works behind the scenes. But again, an empty input field will get rid of it. Time for exercise number 5. Let's repeat the exercise number 3. So that was the one where we were able to enter our own class name, but now with a style for style of our choice. So here I will set up the background color, since it really is the easiest one to see, though that is the reason. And I will name this my style because I want to create an object where I not only have the background color, which is set through the user, but I also want to have the width, which let's say is 100 pixels again, where I also have my height, which is 50, or let's make it 150 pixels to mix things up. And then I want to have my background color, important camel case, or alternative, normal CSS name with the dash in this case, but inside single quotation marks. And then bind this to a property which is set through the user later on. So here initially I will set it to gray, let's say. Well, on this input where I want to let the user change the background color, I can set up vModel to be hooked up to my style background color, because this is the property I want to change by the user, right? And then here on this div, I will simply add vbind, but now I'm not binding to class as before, but I want to set the style, so I'm binding to style. And I pass my style as an argument, which is an object, what style expects to get, which has the width and height and this dynamically settable background color. With Control Enter, we already see this gray div here. And now if I change this to blue, it changes to blue. And of course that works with any color which is recognized. It should also work with hex codes. So that will also work here. Anything which can be interpreted as a valid color in the end. This is how we can make parts of our style dynamic, as you see here. Or of course you can increase this degree of flexibility. You could add inputs setting the width and height. And again, as with the class, of course you can not only react to user input, any place where you change this background color or this width or height or whatever will have the same effect here and will update the styles. This is what this style binding is there for in the end. I'm just choosing user input all the time because it's the easiest to simulate and to play around with for us. Almost done. Time for the last exercise, the most complexest one here. We want to create a simple progress bar below start progress, so this div here shall become the progress bar. In order to make it a progress bar, I will first create a new class, and you could do this in your VueJS instance, of course, too. And all I want to do here is I want to set up a width of 200 pixels and let's say a height of 20 pixels. And I want to give it a border of 1 pixel solid and black so that we can always see the empty progress bar at least. So I can now add a vbind class to use VueJS for that right now, add an array and bind to progress bar with single quotation marks. As you can see, after hitting Control Enter, we now get this progress bar at the bottom. Of course, it's not very interesting right now because it's not updating. Well, we can simply update it by changing the background color style and the width kind of. Now, a real progress bar would have this outer div, this one here, and then an inner div, which reflects the actual bar, whereas the outer div reflects the maximal bar kind of. You could set it up like this. I will make a very simple progress bar where the whole bar grows and possibly shrinks. So this is really just what I set up here. You may of course choose a more complicated progress bar where you have this outer box and this inner bar, but then you also have to make sure that the inner bar stops growing at some point. So this is the default progress bar we'll always see, but now I want to replace the width and background color so that we get a growing one. For that, I first need to hook up start progress with vOn, for example, and listen to our click event here, of course, where I say start progress. This is a function I yet have to create. So I'll do this here after start effect. We have start progress, which is a function where I will use setInterval as well, because I want to, with one L though, because I want to update it every half a second, let's say. And then here, the function, which should get executed every half second. Now in this function, I again need access to my Vue instance, so I'm storing it in a variable, the this keyword, so this reference to my Vue instance. And then here inside setInterval, I want to change some styles which I want to apply to this progress bar here. So I will add vbind style, and I want to bind to a new style, a new object I create in this data property here, which I'll name progress bar. This is a normal JavaScript object, and here I will have a width of, let's say, 0 pixels initially, and I will have a background color of, let's say, red by default, and you could override that. In setInterval, I now want to access this progress bar object I just created, progress bar property, and change the width. Now, to what do I want to change the width though? It should continuously grow, so I somehow also need to increase the width. I need to store the current width and then add something to it, right? Well, outside of this setInterval function here, but in the start progress function, I can simply create a variable width, which I set to 0 initially. And then here in the progress bar, I set width equal to width plus 10, let's say. And then here I can set VM progress bar width equal to width plus, and since this needs to be in pixels, pixels to also convert it to a string. Well, let's try it out by adding it to this style here. The style I want to add is progress bar. Remember, this is the object where I'm overwriting the width down here in the setInterval function. So if I hit Control Enter to let this reload, let's hit start progress, and we see it grow. And this will grow infinitely. It won't stop. So this would be an extra challenge, I guess, to implement some method to make it stop at some point. I will simply reload the application here to, well, make it kind of hard stop here. But this would be a nice little extra, but it's not really core of the styling task, which is why I don't include it here. What this should show you though is how you can work with styles, how I set up my own style object here as a property in the data field, in the data property of my Vue instance, and how I then change a part of this progress bar object, the width, in this setInterval function. And of course I could change any part of it. And of course there are different ways of setting this up. So feel free playing around with styles and classes and getting comfortable binding them dynamically in different ways, changing different things here in VueJS.